Let's begin. But first, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to The Broken Truth. Olivia Bennett's hands shook as she stepped out of the taxi, the weight of her 8-month pregnancy making every movement slow and deliberate. The streetlights glinted off the wet asphalt, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch toward her, mocking her exhaustion. She had spent the entire day at work, navigating endless meetings, and rushing to prenatal appointments, her body begging for rest, her mind hoping Alexander Kane, her husband and CEO of one of the largest companies in the country, would at least notice the toll she had endured. She had imagined walking through the front door and being greeted with a smile, a hand on her back, maybe a quiet word of appreciation, or even a small gesture acknowledging the life growing inside her. But as she approached, she noticed Alexander was not waiting for her. Instead, he was leaning casually against the sleek black car in their driveway, his attention glued to his phone. His expression was impassive, distracted, the kind of cold detachment that had begun to creep into their relationship over the last few months. Olivia's heart sank. She had hoped for warmth, for tenderness, for the slightest recognition of her sacrifices. She swallowed hard, pressing a hand to her belly as the baby kicked sharply, almost as if responding to her racing heartbeat. Then Scarlett Monroe appeared, her presence deliberate, unannounced, and impossible to ignore. She moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged, smiling faintly as her eyes met Alexander's, then flicked toward Olivia. The sight sent a cold shiver down Olivia's spine. She had seen this woman in the past, of course, at events, at company parties, but never like this, never with the implication that she had already taken a place Olivia had assumed was hers. Before Olivia could even find words, Alexander's hand gripped her arm with force she hadn't expected. "Out," he muttered sharply, his voice void of warmth or hesitation. The shove came suddenly, knocking her off balance and onto the cold pavement. The night air bit at her exposed face, and she pressed a hand to her abdomen instinctively, feeling the baby's frantic kicks as if echoing her own shock and terror. Humiliation flooded through her, mingled with disbelief and fear. Tears pricked her eyes, but deep within, a spark of determination ignited. This was more than a moment of cruelty, it was a declaration. Olivia realized in that instant that she would not remain silent, that she would not let this betrayal define her or endanger her child. In the darkness of that midnight street, beneath the indifferent streetlights and the cold stare of the man she once trusted, the first seeds of her plan to reclaim her dignity, safety, and life began to take root. Olivia shivered as she stumbled inside her apartment, her coat damp and clinging to her arms. The cold night had left her numb, but her mind refused to quiet. Every detail of the shove, every smirk and cruel word, replayed vividly in her memory, making her stomach churn and her heart pound. She sank into the couch, one hand pressed to her belly, the other fumbling for her phone. And then it struck her, her dashcam. She had installed it months ago, a precaution she had barely considered, never imagining it would be needed for something like this. Hands trembling, she connected the device and watched the footage load. The screen flickered to life, and there it was, Alexander Kane, cool, detached, speaking words that cut deeper than any slap. He had barely glanced at her, his tone flat, dismissive, as if her presence were a nuisance rather than his pregnant wife. Scarlett Monroe appeared behind him, every movement deliberate, every smile calculated. Her smug satisfaction radiated from the screen, a silent proclamation that she had succeeded in taking Olivia's place. The shove itself was captured in sharp, unflinching detail, the way Alexander's hand pressed against Olivia's arm, the sudden force that sent her teetering onto the curb, and her own flailing, vulnerable body. Olivia pressed her hand to her lips, feeling a rush of fear, humiliation, and disbelief. But beneath that fear, a seed of clarity began to grow. The dashcam hadn't just recorded cruelty, it had preserved proof, undeniable evidence of Alexander's behavior. The video showed the world exactly what had happened, his verbal abuse, the physical shove, and the calculated presence of Scarlett. Each frame was a testament to the violation she had endured, each angle a silent witness that could not be denied. A strange combination of fear and empowerment surged through her. She realized that this footage was no longer just for safety, it was leverage. Not only could she hold Alexander accountable personally, but professionally too. Every reckless, cruel act that had been hidden behind wealth and authority now existed on record, ready to challenge his reputation, his credibility, and his control. Olivia's baby kicked sharply, a reminder that the stakes were far higher than embarrassment or anger. Her child depended on her. The footage was no longer a simple recording, it had become a lifeline, a tool for reclaiming agency in a situation where power had been brutally misused. She knew, with a certainty that steadied her trembling hands, that this dashcam could transform the narrative entirely. Alexander Kane had underestimated her, and the night's events had unintentionally given her the leverage she would need to confront him and reclaim both justice and dignity. Olivia's legs trembled as she stumbled up the steps to Emma Carter's apartment, clutching her coat tightly around her swollen belly. Emma had answered the phone immediately, concern lacing her voice when Olivia had whispered about what had happened. Now, standing safely inside the warmth of Emma's living room, Olivia felt a fragile sense of relief wash over her. The air was soft and calm here, a stark contrast to the cold cruelty she had just endured. Emma guided her to the couch, offering a thick blanket and a glass of water, her steady presence grounding Olivia's frayed nerves. Once seated, Olivia's fingers shook as she connected her dashcam to the laptop. The screen flickered to life, and the footage replayed the scene from the street outside her home. She watched Alexander Kane's indifferent expression, Scarlett Monroe's smug smirk, and the shove that had thrown her into the chill night. Each frame brought a fresh wave of humiliation and anger, but with it, a strange clarity began to emerge. She paused the footage repeatedly, analyzing details, the angle of the shove, Scarlett's body language, Alexander's words, the reaction of the street around them. Her mind, which had felt clouded with shock moments ago, now began to work methodically, identifying opportunities and weaknesses, the first signs of a strategy forming. Emma sat quietly nearby, offering support without interruption. She sensed the shift in Olivia's demeanor, the change from victim to strategist. Olivia's sharp eyes traced the footage again, noting inconsistencies and vulnerabilities in Alexander's behavior. She realized that while the night had been cruel, it had also provided her with irrefutable evidence and insight into his patterns. The humiliation she had suffered could now be transformed into leverage, a tool for reclaiming control over a situation that had felt entirely out of her hands. By the time the night grew late, Olivia felt a small but determined fire burning within her. The fear and vulnerability had not disappeared, but intelligence, resourcefulness, and resolve had taken root. She understood now that this was not the end, it was the beginning of a carefully considered plan. With Emma's support and the dashcam footage as proof, Olivia could confront Alexander on her own terms, protecting herself and her unborn child while reclaiming the dignity he had tried to strip away. Olivia sat at Emma's kitchen table, staring at the dashcam footage looping on her laptop. Each replay brought fresh waves of anger, humiliation, and disbelief, but also clarity. The shove, Scarlett Monroe's smug expression, Alexander Kane's cold detachment, everything was captured in unflinching detail. She traced each moment with her finger, imagining how it could be presented, measured, and ultimately used. The question that weighed on her was not whether to act, but how. Every option carried consequences, and she had to be deliberate. After hours of contemplation, Olivia picked up her phone and called a trusted attorney she had confided in previously. Her voice was steady, controlled, betraying none of the fear that still lingered beneath the surface. She explained the situation, emphasizing the potential personal and professional ramifications, and forwarded the dashcam footage as evidence. The lawyer immediately recognized the magnitude. This was more than domestic betrayal, it was a documented record of public humiliation and corporate misconduct that could jeopardize Alexander's position within his company. Once the legal groundwork was laid, Olivia moved carefully, contacting select members of Alexander's board without revealing her identity. She framed the communication as a concern for company integrity and employee welfare, attaching redacted portions of the footage as proof of recklessness and poor judgment. The board members, accustomed to Alexander's polished public persona, were immediately unsettled. Whispers of impropriety began to ripple through corporate channels. The quiet, controlled ripple was enough to put the first cracks in his empire. Meanwhile, Scarlet, who had once moved with effortless confidence, began to sense the shifting tide. Her earlier smugness faded as rumors reached her, subtle hints of scrutiny and accountability creeping into her carefully curated world. Panic set in, her calculated composure faltering. She realized that Alexander's reckless actions were no longer private and that the consequences of exposure could affect her reputation and security as well. Olivia watched silently, feeling a mixture of vindication and cautious satisfaction. Her dashcam, once a simple tool for safety, had transformed into a powerful instrument of influence. She had shifted the balance of control, demonstrating that Alexander Kane's wealth and authority were not absolute. What began as a personal act of cruelty was now poised to trigger both personal and corporate consequences, foreshadowing a reckoning that neither Alexander nor Scarlet could ignore. Olivia allowed herself a small, controlled smile, knowing that the next moves would define the future for everyone involved. The following morning, the board of Alexander Kane's company convened in a sleek, glass-walled conference room, tension thick in the air. Olivia Bennett's carefully delivered evidence had reached them overnight, and the dashcam footage had already begun to shift the balance of power. The board members, seasoned executives used to navigating corporate maneuvering, watched in stunned silence as the footage played on a large screen. At first, their attention focused on the obvious personal betrayal, the shove, Scarlett Monroe's smug intrusion, and Alexander's cold disregard for his pregnant wife. But as the video continued, subtler details began to emerge, revealing far more troubling professional behavior. Alexander had used the company car to ferry Scarlett to private events, an improper use of corporate resources. Internal communications hinted at favoritism, with certain projects being redirected to benefit Scarlett's personal ventures, undermining company protocol and ethical standards. The footage also suggested liability risks, leaving a pregnant woman unattended and at risk, during a hostile encounter involving his executive privileges, could open the company to lawsuits and regulatory scrutiny. Board members exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. Wealth and authority could no longer shield Alexander from accountability. In the corner of the room, Alexander sat rigid, his polished demeanor beginning to crack. He had always believed that his personal life could remain separate from his professional empire, that loyalty and intimidation within the company would prevent any challenge to his authority. Now, those assumptions were collapsing. The footage had not only documented personal humiliation, it had exposed systemic breaches of trust, misuse of corporate resources, and behaviors that could jeopardize the company's standing. Every violation, every indiscretion, was laid bare for the board's scrutiny. Tension rose palpably as the meeting continued. The board questioned department heads, cross-referencing company records, and confirming the patterns Olivia's dashcam had illuminated. Alexander's earlier arrogance faltered under the weight of facts and accountability. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that the private cruelty he had exercised toward Olivia was no longer confined to their personal lives, it had entered the corporate sphere, threatening his position, reputation, and control over the company he had built from the ground up. As the board deliberated quietly, Alexander's mind raced. He understood that every reckless action, every misused privilege, and every instance of favoritism could now become grounds for removal or legal action. The power he had once wielded so effortlessly was slipping, and for the first time, he recognized that personal betrayal had professional consequences far beyond anything he had anticipated. Olivia's dashcam had done more than capture humiliation, it had dismantled the wall he had built between his personal indiscretions and corporate authority, and Alexander Kane was beginning to see that his empire could crumble just as easily as his carefully curated image. Alexander Kane sat in his office, the city lights glittering beneath him, trying to mask the growing panic with a practiced calm. The board's inquiries and Olivia Bennett's carefully orchestrated evidence had shaken him more than he cared to admit. He knew he had to regain control, and his first instinct was manipulation. He called Olivia, his voice dripping with false concern. "Olivia, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen that way. Can we just talk this through?" He offered gifts through intermediaries, expensive bouquets, jewelry, and vouchers for prenatal care, each one a thinly veiled attempt to buy her silence. But Olivia had already seen this pattern before. She understood his tactics, his way of using charm and wealth to bend situations to his favor. Each apology felt hollow, each gift a subtle threat disguised as generosity. She replied calmly, firmly, refusing to be coerced or intimidated. She reminded herself that her child's safety, her dignity, and her legal standing were more valuable than any fleeting truce or empty promise. Scarlett Monroe, sensing Alexander's faltering control, began to escalate her involvement. She inserted herself into phone calls, text exchanges, and even board communications, trying to influence decisions and protect her precarious position. Her presence, once a tool of intimidation, now added tension and complexity to Alexander's already unstable strategy. She whispered in his ear, pressed for solutions, and attempted to manipulate the narrative in their favor, but every effort only highlighted the fragility of their alliance. Meanwhile, Olivia's confidence grew steadily. The dashcam footage, the legal advice, and the subtle shift in the board's perception had given her both moral and professional leverage. She realized that Alexander's wealth and intimidation no longer dictated outcomes. Each time he tried to sway her, she countered calmly, documenting interactions meticulously. Every attempt at manipulation became evidence, every threat a risk he could not take. The power struggle reached its peak as Alexander recognized that his authority over Olivia was slipping irreversibly. His personal tactics of charm, intimidation, and bribery were ineffective against a woman armed with proof, legal guidance, and an unshakable sense of self-preservation. Olivia Bennet had transformed from a victim into a strategist, gaining control not just over her personal life, but over the corporate and ethical accountability that Alexander had underestimated. The night's events had set the stage, the battle lines were drawn, and for the first time, Alexander Kane realized that he might have underestimated the very person he had tried to dominate. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of Olivia Bennet's apartment, but she barely noticed it. Her focus was entirely on the documents spread across the dining table, the dashcam footage playing quietly on her laptop, and the steady stream of messages from her attorney. Legal counsel had been engaged immediately, and every piece of evidence, every frame of the footage, every recorded interaction, every detail of Alexander Kane's misconduct, was being meticulously catalogued. The lawyer emphasized the seriousness of the case. Alexander's actions had crossed the boundary between personal cruelty and potential corporate liability. Olivia absorbed every word, taking notes, asking precise questions, and ensuring that nothing was overlooked. Across the city, the board members of Alexander's company were deep in deliberation. Shareholders and investors had been notified discreetly, and scrutiny of Alexander's conduct intensified with each passing hour. The dashcam footage revealed patterns of recklessness and misuse of corporate resources that could no longer be ignored. Board members cross-checked emails, internal communications, and corporate records, confirming the implications Olivia had hinted at. Alexander's once unassailable reputation began to wobble under the combined weight of public exposure and corporate accountability. Meanwhile, Olivia turned her attention to the practical and personal matters at hand. She began preparing for custody arrangements and financial protections for herself and her unborn child. Every precaution was deliberate, ensuring that she would be shielded from retaliation and positioned to maintain autonomy over her life. Public vindication was also part of her strategy. Olivia understood that confronting Alexander privately was insufficient. The truth had to be acknowledged publicly to prevent him from continuing a cycle of manipulation and abuse. Scarlett Monroe, once so assured and untouchable, began to unravel under the pressure of scrutiny. Rumors circulated, and subtle whispers within Alexander's corporate circles began to erode her influence. Her confidence faltered as she realized that wealth and manipulation could no longer insulate her from exposure. Every attempt to maintain control became more desperate, and cracks began to show in her carefully constructed facade. Through it all, Olivia remained calm, measured, and deliberate. The combination of legal strategy, corporate accountability, and personal foresight had shifted the balance of power. She was no longer a passive participant in the drama that had been thrust upon her. She had become an architect of consequence, ensuring that every act of betrayal, cruelty, and recklessness would be addressed, and that she and her child would emerge protected, vindicated, and empowered. Olivia Bennet arrived at the boardroom early, her steps steady, her expression composed. The conference table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the board members murmured softly as they gathered, sensing the tension that had been building for days. Olivia carried with her the dashcam footage that had become both shield and weapon, the undeniable proof of Alexander Kane's recklessness, cruelty, and professional misconduct. Every interaction, every shove, every whispered word from Scarlett Monroe had been documented, and tonight, it would serve as the foundation for her confrontation. As the meeting commenced, Olivia requested a moment to address the board directly. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned toward her. Calmly, she played the footage on the large screen, framing it with precise commentary that highlighted not just the personal betrayal, but the corporate violations, misuse of company resources, favoritism towards Scarlett's ventures, and liability risks stemming from Alexander's reckless behavior. Board members exchanged shocked glances, some murmuring, others taking notes furiously. The weight of proof made denial impossible. Alexander, who had arrived confident in his authority, found his carefully constructed persona unraveling. He opened his mouth to speak, to deflect, to charm, but every argument was undermined by the evidence Olivia presented. His body language shifted, he slumped slightly in his chair, awareness dawning that control had slipped through his fingers. Loyalty among his inner circle began to falter. Board members, previously deferential, now leaned toward Olivia's perspective, recognizing both the legal and ethical imperative to respond. Scarlett Monroe's composure cracked entirely. The smugness that had once defined her presence dissolved into anxious glances and whispered side conversations. She realized that the protective shield Alexander had provided was gone, and with it, her own position became precarious. Every attempt to intervene, every whispered counsel, fell flat against Olivia's clear, controlled presentation of facts. By the end of the meeting, Olivia had not only exposed Alexander's misconduct but had also demonstrated a mastery of the situation that left no room for argument. She had shifted the balance of power entirely, asserting control over both personal and professional outcomes. Alexander's authority had been challenged publicly and privately, while Olivia's credibility, foresight, and composure had been elevated in equal measure. What began as a personal act of cruelty had now become a turning point, proving that evidence, strategy, and courage could confront and dismantle even the most entrenched systems of power. Olivia walked out of that boardroom knowing she had reclaimed her agency, protected her child, and ensured that accountability would be enforced. Alexander Kane awoke to a world that no longer revolved around him. The lawsuits had begun, meticulously filed by Olivia Bennet and supported by the concrete evidence captured on her dashcam. Each claim, emotional abuse, endangerment, misuse of corporate assets, was supported by undeniable proof, leaving little room for evasion or denial. Media outlets had picked up fragments of the story, their headlines exposing Alexander's private cruelty to public scrutiny. Stock prices wavered, investors demanded answers, and colleagues whispered cautiously, unsure of where loyalty now lay. The billionaire who had once commanded absolute control over both his company and household found himself vulnerable and exposed. Scarlett Monroe, once an emblem of influence and advantage, began to vanish from the narrative. Without Alexander's protection, her carefully cultivated position crumbled. Calls went unanswered, invitations ceased, and her presence in both social and corporate spheres diminished rapidly. The power she had relied upon evaporated as quickly as it had appeared, leaving her isolated and insignificant in the eyes of those who had once admired or feared her. Meanwhile, Olivia Bennet's life began to shift toward stability and empowerment. The legal battles she had anticipated were underway, but she was fully prepared. Custody arrangements, financial protection for herself and her unborn child, and public vindication were being meticulously secured. Every move she made was deliberate, guided by clarity and foresight, and each action strengthened her position. She had transformed from a victim of betrayal into a woman who wielded her own agency, capable of defending both her personal and professional interests. Alexander, for the first time, felt the stark limits of wealth and authority. His influence could not shield him from accountability, his fortune could not erase the evidence of his wrongdoing, and his charisma could not persuade those now demanding truth and justice. The empire he had carefully built was beginning to fracture under the combined pressure of legal action, corporate scrutiny, and public exposure. Every decision he had made in private now bore consequences in the public and professional spheres. As Olivia moved forward with confidence, Alexander was left to reckon with the collapse he could no longer control. The lessons were harsh and inescapable. No amount of money could protect him from truth, no position of power could absolve him of responsibility, and no charm could reverse the impact of his reckless actions. Olivia Bennet had emerged stronger, her dignity intact, her rights secured, and her future reclaimed, proving that justice could prevail even against the most entrenched forms of privilege and authority. The morning sunlight streamed through the hospital room, warm and golden, as Olivia Bennet held her newborn daughter close, feeling the steady rise and fall of her tiny chest against her own. 8 months of fear, betrayal, and struggle had culminated in this quiet, victorious moment. Her body ached, but the exhaustion was tempered by an overwhelming sense of relief and triumph. The baby's soft coos filled the room, a tender reminder that life and hope could emerge even after the darkest nights. Emma Carter sat beside her, squeezing Olivia's hand with tears glistening in her eyes. Margaret Bennet and Henry Rivers hovered nearby, pride and love etched across their faces. The support surrounding Olivia was more than comfort, it was a shield, a declaration that she was no longer alone, that she had reclaimed both her safety and her dignity. Alexander Kane, conspicuously absent, had been excluded from every step of the recovery. His attempts at reconciliation, influence, or intimidation held no weight here. The circle of love and protection around Olivia was proof that accountability and boundaries had been firmly established. The Dashcam, once a silent witness to cruelty, now rested beside Olivia on the bedside table. Its presence was symbolic, a tangible reminder of truth, empowerment, and the careful strategy that had enabled her to navigate the chaos. Every frame had contributed to her legal protections, every angle had exposed Alexander's recklessness, and every second had reaffirmed that vigilance, courage, and intelligence could overcome betrayal and manipulation. Olivia smiled faintly at the device, knowing it represented far more than evidence, it represented her agency, her resolve, and the life she had fought to protect. In the days that followed, Olivia focused on rebuilding her life. She took small, deliberate steps toward independence, managing finances, connecting with supportive friends, and planning for her daughter's future. She nurtured her physical and emotional well-being, ensuring that strength replaced fear and clarity replaced doubt. Every choice she made reinforced her autonomy, demonstrating that resilience was born from adversity and that dignity could not be taken, only surrendered. As she gazed at her sleeping child, Olivia reflected on the journey she had endured. Betrayal had been exposed, power misused had crumbled, and through strategy, courage, and steadfastness, life had been reclaimed. She had transformed pain into empowerment, fear into foresight, and despair into determination. The past no longer held sway over her. Olivia Bennet had emerged whole, independent, and resolute, a testament to the enduring strength of resilience, the justice of truth, and the unwavering power of reclaiming one's own life. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to The Broken Truth.